Okay, so thanks everybody for bearing with us. It wouldn't be a conference if there wasn't a few technical difficulties. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker for today, Helen Phillips, also from UTAS, and she'll be talking about observations of mixing and stirring in the Antarctic circumpolar current. So please take it away, Helen.
Thank you, Kat. Hi, everyone. So I put up a TS diagram, not realising that Annie would have gone through many TS diagrams in her talk, but this one is an upper ocean TS diagram, and I've put it there because it illustrates the state of the ocean in response to all the processes that have taken place, including mixing and stirring. And we can see mixing through the vertical stratification of the profiles and the highly uniform properties of the circumpolar deep water. And we can see stirring in the excursions on the temperature and salinity diagram along isopycnals, sort of moving warm water south and cold water north. So that sort of sets the tone of this talk. It's very much from an observational oceanographer's perspective. And I've put up a map here to show the four major field programs that we've had over the last little while. And the background there is surface speed from satellite altimeter. So we've focused on the Antarctic circumpolar current largely, but also currents in the Southeast Indian Ocean. And each of these has involved EM apex profiling floats, which is shown on the right there. And that's what's produced this really finely sampled collection of TS profiles in the subantarctic front in this case. The right-hand map just shows the trajectories of the floats that we deployed in this program north of the Kerguelen Plateau. And the colours show you the dynamic height of the sea surface. So red is north of the subantarctic front, and blue is down close to the polar front. We use other instruments too, and so a microstructure profiler gives direct estimates of diapycnal mixing through the dissipation of turbulent kinetic energy. And of course, the workhorse of oceanography, the CTD and lowered ADCP package. I've put up here a velocity profile and three actually. So the blue and the red are two profiles made by an EM apex float, half an inertial period apart. So they're showing you the mirror imaging that occurs with the inertial oscillations. And they're quite large in terms of their amplitude. And in order to isolate these inertial oscillations from the background current, we can average inertial paired profiles, and the green line is then the subinertial current. That's useful for looking at other things. So just to step back a little into how we observe mixing in the ocean, I'm going to focus to begin with on diapycnal mixing and then move to stirring. When we think about internal waves in the ocean, this schematic illustrates very nicely the generation of currents at the sea floor through interaction of geostrophic currents and tidal currents with bathymetry, and their radiation away from the bottom of and up into the water column where they break at some later stage. Sorry, I'm a bit trigger happy. And then also at the sea surface, wind forcing drives the generation of near inertial currents that propagate down into the interior. So the interior is a complicated mess of upward propagating waves and downward propagating waves that interact with each other, but also interact with the geostrophic flow and eddies and other things. So if we were to measure the mixing that results from breaking internal waves, so we have these initial horizontal scales that are order 1 to 10 meters in the vertical. That then, those waves become unstable and overturn and drive turbulent mixing. That's on the scale of around millimetre to centimetre in the vertical. To measure this turbulent mixing directly, we need quite sophisticated microstructure profilers that measure the spectra of vertical shear on these centimetre scales. And that results in, that gives us the dissipation of turbulent kinetic energy, or epsilon. We can then get the diapicnal diffusivity through this relationship, which takes the dissipation, multiplies it by a mixing efficiency gamma, and divides it by the square of the buoyancy frequency. So there's our first assumption, is that the mixing efficiency is a constant value. But as assumptions go, that's not a bad one. More traditional instruments can only measure at this 1 to 10 metre vertical scale. So that's our CTD, LADCP, and the higher vertical resolution of the EM apex floats. And with those measurements, we can use indirect methods that take these larger scales, applies a range of assumptions to get epsilon and K rho, or diapicnal diffusivity. So surprisingly, in spite of all the assumptions, it's been shown that these fine scale measurements agree with microstructure measurements to within a factor of 2 to 3. And I just wanted to distinguish between shear strain parameterizations that use both information about velocity fluctuations and density fluctuations, and the strain only parameterizations, which only know about the density fluctuations in the water column. And that's all we can use with the Argo array. So there are a couple of very nice reviews that have a lot more information. So we have some understanding of the broad scale spatial structure of mixing in the ocean. And this study by Amy Waterhouse compiled all of the global data sets of microstructure. And in the upper ocean, above 1,000 metres, they supplemented that with high quality indirect estimates to get this map on the left of diapicnal diffusivity. And you can see that while there are some well-covered regions in this average picture, there are a lot of places where there's no information. And then if we go deeper, we're only able to use ship research voyage lines through the WOS and Go Ship programs, and also some deep current meter moorings. So there's a lot of places where we could get more information if we were able to. The Argo array presents a very nice opportunity to get more information about mixing. So there are many more profiles from Argo than there are from microstructure profilers. And so this map on the left shows the average diffusivity from all Argo floats in upper part of the ocean using a strain-only parameterization. And you can see that there's strong spatial variability, and it's been shown that there's really clear dependence on topography, winds and eddies and fronts. But this assumes a frequency content of the internal wave field, and that may vary from place to place. There's also some broad scale temporal information in the form of the seasonal cycles. This one is an average over the subtropical northern latitudes, but it shows that the strong seasonal forcing extends down to at least 2,000 metres, and it's well correlated with the change in the energy flux from the wind. So as the winter winds pick up, that drives stronger mixing. But those are very broad brush estimates, and it would be nice to get down to finer scale measurements and really start to look at the factors that control the variation in amplitude and structure of mixing. And so this is an example from the SOFINE experiment at the Northern Kerguelen Plateau, which is the first time we put a fleet of EM apex floats in the water. The top panel shows the geostrophic speed from satellite, and the black dots are the CTD profiles from both the ship and the floats. So Amelie Meyer did this in her PhD work. She characterised the diapicnal diffusivity and dissipation from the floats, and this is a compilation of the 8 floats side by side, showing many orders of magnitude variations in diffusivity. and strong vertical structure. So Emily looked at dividing up these profiles according to various dynamical regimes and proximity to rough topography and other things. So an example in this middle panel is separating out the profiles that are in the subantarctic zone, the polar front zone, and within the subantarctic front in black. And so it's clear that that strong dependence on current speed is there. We also had microstructure measurements during this program, and the orange line in the right shows the direct estimate of dissipation from microstructure compared with what we got from the EM apex floats. So that led Emily to make this very nice schematic of the interactions that were controlling some of the variability in the mixing, and this ACC flow over steep bathymetry driving lee waves up into the water column, and the wind forcing driving near inertial waves were very clear, but also the interaction with the eddies and the fronts. More recently, we had an experiment south of Tasmania in a standing meander of the polar front. So we targeted this location as a hotspot of poleward heat flux from global maps, and we were motivated to look more at the physical processes controlling both that poleward heat flux, but also the momentum balance of the ACC as it interacts with bathymetry. So the left shows the bathymetry, the Southeast Indian Ridge and Macquarie Ridge, and the meander sits between those. On the right, the shading indicates current speed, and the grey dots are the shipboard transects we undertook. The sea surface height is an average over the full voyage, so it doesn't line up with our cross-front transects beautifully. And then the bottom panel shows the trajectories of 3 of the EM apex floats, and you can see that they had a wild ride. There was eddy formation going on in this trough of the meander, and they covered many dynamical regimes. On the right, it's a little small, but it's just an illustration of the different fields we can diagnose from the float. So shear, anticipation, and diffusivity in the top 3 panels. And you can see again that strong vertical structure and intense events of mixing. So Ajitha Syriac, who's a postdoc with us, has done some work to try to tease out the key relationships, and she found that in fact topography wasn't a big factor in controlling the variability. So these are comparisons of smooth profiles taken over smooth and rough topography. But that doesn't mean that there aren't lee waves forming. It may mean that the internal waves we're measuring have been generated further afield, or it may mean that our upper ocean measurements are just not capturing the lee wave propagation through the water column. Ajitha also divided up the floats according to dynamical regime, so polar front in blue, subantarctic front in pink, and cold core and warm core eddies in blue and red, and looking at them in different water mass layers. So one interesting feature that came out was the Antarctic intermediate water within cyclonic eddies had a much more amplified mixing than in other regimes. All right, so now I'm going to flip over to stirring. And so again, there are broad scale estimates of isopycnal stirring. This example is from Sylvia Cole, who used Argo salinity anomalies on density and brought in Echo 2 for the velocity measurements that she needed. And she used a mixing length approach and found this bottom map is the distribution of horizontal diffusivity, highlighting real zonal bands of strong diffusivity. But we can also look at stirring from the floats, and now I'm looking at the EM apex that were deployed in this region south of Tasmania. So they started very close together and very quickly moved apart. And if we look at the TS diagrams from each of those different floats, we can see that they experienced a varying range of stirring or different nature excursions in the TS diagrams. And one, which was caught in a cyclonic eddy, had very, very little stirring at all. So there's strong variability in the stirring, and Maya Jakes is working to quantify that stirring using various methods. And I'll skip over that because I think we might run out of time. I'm going to step aside now to look at the very detailed processes of cross-frontal movement that drive water mass variations in a meander. So this is a slightly different meander, but south of Tasmania, and there was a hydrographic survey and no profiling floats. And Yanyap Maya has worked on this survey and wanting to diagnose the transformation of water properties as you move from upstream of the meander and downstream along the meander. And so to do that, he developed a gravest empirical mode climatology using the CTD profiles that were collected. And essentially it's collapsing all of these transects into a single meridional transect that gives us temperature and salinity as a function of dynamic height for our meridional coordinate and pressure for the vertical coordinate. So that mean field is then the reference that we use to look at the variations from one transect to the next as we move through the meander. So the westernmost transect we see has the anomalies right here, and these are using density as a vertical coordinate and dynamic height as a meridional coordinate. So each panel moves from west to east, and you can see that there are some places that are warmer than the mean and some places that are cooler. And I should have said this is what the mean field looks like, very nicely ordered TS profiles. So Yanyap brought in satellite information to describe the velocities at the sea surface and to explain those cross-frontal exchanges and leading to the property change along the meander. So when we think about currents from sea surface height, we tend to think of geostrophic velocities. But in places where there's strong curvature in the flow, the centrifugal force becomes important, and the gradient wind balance is actually more appropriate. And so Yanyap has diagnosed the gradient wind from satellite sea surface height, and that's shown here in the shading, and that's overlaid with the vectors from the shipboard ADCP during the voyage and averaged over the mixed layer. On the right is the difference between the gradient wind and the geostrophic velocity, but it's normalized by the total gradient wind. So it shows you that the ageostrophic velocities can be of order 10% in this meander, and they accelerate the flow in the crest of the meander in green, and they decelerate it in blue in the trough of the meander. And so these accelerations and decelerations drive divergence and convergence of the surface flow, and that drives cross-frontal exchange and vertical motion, which I'll explain a little bit about here. So we've got a map of the divergence at the sea surface. Brown indicates convergence near the trough, and green indicates divergence between the trough and the crest. So where we have convergence, we line that up with this region entering the trough in the temperature anomaly field. So each column represents a transect, and each cell is the average temperature across the front at each density level. So what we're seeing is a cooling as we move along stream in this first part where we have convergence, And that's associated with cold advection, or that describes a cold advection and a downwelling. And where we have divergence, there's warm advection and upwelling. So that reference to vertical motion now needs a little explanation. And we go to a paper by Amy Bauer using Rayfors floats in the Gulf Stream. These schematics show a meridional structure in density from south to north and with depth as the vertical coordinate. On an isopycnal, the water's colder in the south and warmer in the north. And so a little water parcel that moves poleward will experience upwelling, and it's carrying warm water to a cold place. A water parcel that moves equatorward will experience downwelling, and it's carrying cold water to a warmer place. So that's essentially what Yanyap's described in this more complicated panel. And it's a process describing poleward heat transport. So the next step was to look in the access model just to see whether those relationships were in fact present in the model. And all of the shading in this slide is divergence, with green indicating divergence and brown convergence. So this map at the sea surface looks very similar to what we had from the satellite sea surface height, but now we have the vertical structure beneath that following the central contour of this meander. So where we have divergence at the sea surface, you can see that that extends through the water column. And we also have vertical velocity from the model, and that divergence is associated with upwelling and convergence is associated with downwelling. And then if we go and look, look at the meridional sections. So this one, number one, through a convergent patch, we see that there is equatorward flow, downwelling, and cold advection. You might have to look in detail later, but I'll just flip through it. And then a transects through a divergent patch shows a poleward flow with upwelling and warm advection. So that's work in prep for publication, but confirms what we were seeing in the observations. So all of these small scale processes are delivering what we observe in these large scale maps, like this one from Annie, of poleward heat transport. It's showing us where heat crosses the fronts of the ACC, and the one that we're focused on is right here in the little black box. And some other work by Ram Patel at UTAS has been exploring the variability of fluxes of not only heat, but also salt and nutrients in the OFAM 3 10th degree model. So how do we scale up from our very detailed process studies to the whole Southern Ocean? And one tool that's been used a lot in the past is a gravest empirical mode climatology. And in this case, we're talking about one that applies to the whole circumpolar belt. So at every longitude, we have a meridional section that tells us the structure of temperature and salinity as a function of dynamic height as our meridional coordinate and pressure or depth as the vertical coordinate. And if we apply satellite sea surface height fields, we can move around those temperature and salinity patterns to build a shape of the ocean on that day that the satellite field was measured. And so Andrew Myers developed one that's been very useful in 2011, and we now have James Wyatt working on an update that will bring in vast quantities of new Argo and BGC Argo data, but also incorporate our new understanding of the ageostrophic flow and build that into the GEM so that the GEM will now be capable of moving heat across fronts, not just following streamlines. So that'll be a huge advantage. And then, of course, we'll continue to mine the existing data sets where we have co-located velocity and density information and the stars indicate locations where we plan new deployments. So I just will finish on the happy faces of some of the postdocs and students who've contributed to this work. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. We have maybe time for one or two quick questions.